Welcome to Storycomic Presents, where we interview amazing storytellers and artists. This is episode 221. I'm your host, Barney Smith of Storycomic.com, and we're excited to have with us the internationally acclaimed and award-winning writer and game designer and owner, Jamie Chambers. Jamie.
All right. Thanks for having me on. I'm doing good.
You're welcome.
You tripped over the first hurdle there.
It's true, though. It is true, because in your bio, you have won awards.
I have won a number of awards.
Yeah, that's right. Yep.
I did have, like I said, I recently got a new day job, and I took my Origins Award, the one I did for my biggest project. And I popped on it because that's the equivalent of having an Oscar, in the game industry. So yeah, I have won awards. I have been published in other languages. So nothing you said was technically not true, but I feel very uncomfortable anyway. It's like, especially these days, because I haven't done anything in a while.
And so what you do have, though, is like one of the things we were talking about before. You also have an extremely fun podcast that I actually started listening to as well, called Chainsaw History. I listened to your George Washington episode.
Where we first started.
So before, when we want to jump into it, and I know there's a lot of questions, a lot of fun stuff that I want to talk to you about. Do you want to first kind of give people a little bit of background for those that might not be familiar with your history, how you got into writing, both prose, books, and then also game design?
Sure. When you want to go really way back, I got into writing and playing tabletop games the same year. It was literally third grade. I was 8 years old. I started writing assignments just for class, and little short story kind of things when I was 8 years old. And my teacher encouraged me to enter the local Young Authors Fair. Okay. And so I submitted this stupid little short story I wrote about a cat, and I won first place that year. And I found that I enjoyed both writing and I enjoyed the attention I could get from doing that sort of thing. So literally, I entered the Young Authors Fair locally in my school every single year, and took home a blue ribbon every single year from 3rd through 8th grade. Okay. And so that was part of it. And then the same year, 8 years old, was 1983. And one day my dad brought me home the big D&D red box, the Larry Elmore, cover with the red dragon on it. And I'd already gotten to like sort of play D&D with some older kids, but I didn't know what was going on. But the moment I got that box set, that was like my two kind of obsessions were set in front of me, like that were for the rest of my life. It's like, well, I love stories, both reading and writing them, and I enjoy games, and I like mixing the two a lot. So like, no matter what else I'm doing in my life, those things will always be going on. And that's kind of where that started. In terms of how I got into more of a professional kind of thing, I was right. So now we fast forward to the end of high school. And now we're in 1993, like 10 years later. And I have been, at this point, a D&D obsessed guy for that entire decade. And I was reading Dragon Magazine, and I kept seeing that TSR, the company that published D&D, was they'd finally created like an online presence in the very fledgling internet. So for the boys and girls listening at home who don't remember the dark times, when you used to have to like dial up with a fax machine noise just to get this crappy little signal, we had, instead of having just like an internet connection that you would pay for, like you literally had an online service. You had to dial in with a phone, and they were kind of little walled gardens. You'd have CompuServe, and then later on you had like the Sierra Network, later on America Online. But one of the earliest ones was called Genie, and it was run by General Electric. And TSR was on GE's service, and they had what they called the TSR Online Roundtable. So they would host all the major like writers and game designers associated with D&D and all the other stuff going on with TSR in the 90s. So I just kind of joined up and spent way more money than I should have, because it was like hourly fees on this thing. Right. I ran up like a $300 bill the first month, and I had to work it off. But I got so involved with the stuff that was going on with TSR Online at the time that so it's like within a couple of months of being involved, like I got elected president of the very first online gaming club that I'm aware of, at least. We've never learned of an earlier one than us. There's like one that came out like 3 months later. But we had something like just under 200 members. Like I was 19 years old by at that point. That was with the Role Playing Game Association, which was kind of an offshoot of TSR. And then not only that, but they're like, well, we can get this kid to do a bunch of work for free. So they basically they made me a staff member, which is kind of like I was like an online intern. And I got free access to the TSR area. As long as I stayed inside their little walled garden, I wouldn't incur the hourly access fees. And in exchange for this privilege and plus free product, TSR had me do all kinds of work for them on that. So I was hosting and moderating chats. So I was literally doing what you're doing right now, except I was on your end and it was pure text only, just moderated chats with a bunch of fans asking questions. So that's how I got to know originally like Ed Greenwood and Jeff Grubb and Tracy Hickman and all these like names of both authors and game designers and some artists. And so like I started like talking to these people literally every week, and I was part of this little community. And then that kind of at that point it was just inevitable. I started volunteering for anything anybody wanted me to do because I was a little fanboy. And they started giving me work, and that kind of led to opportunities and to actually earn freelance dollars, write for things. And I moved on to a full-on career from there. I got out of college. I was in college at the time, did 1 year in the real world before I got a full-time job offer in the game industry. And I was like, and I'm gone.
Wow. Okay. And what was that position?
That was when I moved up to Wisconsin to work as a writer game designer full-time. Originally for Sovereign Press. It was Larry Elmore's Sovereign Stone was the game setting that we were doing at the time.
Okay. Wow.
So yeah, I've known all these people. So it's like a combination of that. At the same time, I started going to conventions, and I started spending a lot of time meeting people at some of those. So like that's how I got to know a lot of the artists. Like Larry Elmore and I have worked together many times and been friends for years.
Right. And so from there, you really started really concentrating on basically just Dungeons and Dragons then as a writer for that.
Well, weirdly, the weird thing was in the beginning, I was working on non-D&D based games. But then when we hit the year 2000, that was when D&D 3rd edition came out, and this crazy thing happened to our industry called the open game license. Suddenly, any publisher could publish D&D compatible stuff. And so anybody who was a gamer back then suddenly knew that everything became D&D for a couple of years. Like everything was D20 compatible. Right. So I took Sovereign Stone, which was originally a non-D&D game, and then we used and part of the problem with Sovereign Stone was that a lot of the talent, from the artists to the writers, were all associated with D&D, and yet we were giving the audience a non-D&D fantasy game. And suddenly the open game license presented this opportunity. It's like, well, we could give them the D&D game that they're all wanting anyway. So we married Sovereign Stone to the D20 system. And then I became, for several years, between Sovereign Stone and Dragonlance, I was doing exclusively D&D for a few years. Right. And then it flipped, and just as the market was going good, we had the opportunity to do a game based on Firefly. Or at least the movie based on that, and D&D was the wrong rule set for that kind of experience. So that was when I stripped everything down and built a new game for that. Right. So
talk to us a bit about that.
That did not use a D20.
Right. So talk to us a bit about that system that you helped create.
Yeah, that was the Cortex system. Right. Which these days has been sold a couple of times. It now belongs. I don't even remember the name of the company. It was Fandom Entertainment owned it until a couple months ago, and then they sold it off to another digital company. But but the Cortex system, the basic idea was to have a game with very streamlined mechanics, where like my kind of goal going in was I wanted to the way you would play, and I wanted the fun you would get from either being a combat focused character versus someone who is more a socially focused character or a technically focused character. So you're thinking Firefly. I'm thinking, do you want to be a Jane, Mal, or Zoe, or do you want to be a Kaylee, Simon, or Wash?
Right.
And I wanted it to be just as much fun to play, you know, the quote unquote wimp characters and have them have lots of stuff to do. And I wanted the rules to be just as engaging and feel the same no matter what. So that was kind of the idea. And then we used every dice in the bag except D20. We kind of we rejected the D20 system completely.
And so was that based off of just the idea of saying we don't want any D20, or did you just have that system evolve into that?
Well, it was an evolution because it actually, funny enough, like I said, I told you I started working originally with Sovereign Stone.
Right.
And the original Sovereign Stone game system was designed by my friend Lester Smith. And it had this, I mean, I loved it. I had this beautiful, elegant game engine. It just wasn't the right one for a very kind of D&D-esque fantasy world. So I, like, even though I pulled Sovereign Stone away from this game I really liked, I was like, well, these mechanics are still really good. We need to find the right thing for them. So I kind of stripped the Sovereign Stone game engine down to its very most basic things, and even kind of pulled a few extra things off and then rebuilt it into the Cortex system. But that's also one of the reasons why every Cortex product that I did always thanked Lester, you know, as part of it, and acknowledged the fact that he created the original rules. It's kind of like anybody who plays Fate right now, Fudge was kind of the original system they based that on. So it's kind of the same relationship. As Sovereign Stone was kind of the, or better to say, Cortex is kind of like the spiritual successor to the original Sovereign Stone game engine. Where I just kind of like, I really like the basic dice mechanics and the flow, and it's like everything else kind of came off from there.
Now, how does that work? For instance, to create that system, how long did it take you to play test it to kind of hone in any of the issues with it?
Well, ultimately, it took a couple of years, but we had something we could play within a couple of weeks. Like,
okay,
I mean, the good news was I wasn't inventing the wheel, because I was kind of like taking some pre-existing basic mechanics. I at least had, it was like having the frame of the car to build everything on, as opposed to having to start from literally nothing. So I kind of, within like 2 weeks of coming up with the idea, I had like character sheets and a basic idea of how the game would go, and something we could actually test out. And then from there, though, it was many iterations, many work, and even after we published, we kept working on the game.
Now, so from there too, is like with that with Cortex, do you prefer, because this seems to be both your wheelhouses, do you like game design of a system, or do you like game design as in the world building piece? What ones do you feel more comfortable doing? Yes.
Honestly, it's both. I mean, the truth is, I mean, at this point, I've designed 2 complete role-playing system engines, and I don't know that I'm looking like, it's cool, but like there are other people who are better at it than me that are really innovative and do these really cutting edge things. Like my games, I like to think, I mean, I admit it, I'm more of a hack. I don't necessarily have an original idea, but I find things I like and figure out how to make them work together. So like for me, probably I think I get the most out of developing existing material or adapting something else. And I love and honestly, I'll write fluff all day long. Like, I enjoy even the non-crunchy side of games, and getting into descriptions. Like, I've worked on a lot of licensed stuff, so you know, I've worked in, you know, Sovereign Stone, Dragonlance, Larry Elmore's Snarf Quest comic. We did a thing on Mars for Fast Forward Entertainment. And then I did, you know, Firefly / Serenity, Battlestar Galactica, Supernatural, Demon Hunters, from my friends at Dead Gentlemen. That's where I got the backstab with the ballista thing. I did a game with them using Cortex.
And so you've also designed, you've also been a part of making some like card games as well, correct?
Yeah. Over the years, I've published a couple of card games, 1 board game. But the most, I mean, it's been a while. Like, we're now, I think, 11 years from when we published my company's card game, Building an Elder God.
And so how is it different creating a card game as compared to making a system for, say, a tabletop role-playing game?
There's so many different approaches you can do to both. It's really hard to pin down. Right. So it's more like how this applies to me. But yeah, for me, RPG systems are hugely different, because with a card game, you really are in a completely different world where it's all, you have to decide first what kind of card, what is the standard kind of play. Are there's everything these days from deck building to, there's trick-based card games. I don't know. That's really tough. Just like RPGs, there's so many ways to go. And like for the one we did was very much inspired by older games. So we kind of just stole old mechanics lying around, because once again, kind of what we do. Anyone who ever played, there's an old game from Parker Brothers called Waterworks. I don't know if anybody ever remembers that, but it was literally just, you were literally building pipes and plumbing systems and you'd repair problems with a wrench and stuff like that. Well, Building an Elder God was taking that same basic tile laying idea, but doing it with Cthulhu monsters and tentacles. So you're trying to build your own monster and take a shotgun to someone else's to slow them down.
Right.
And so it's like, in that case, there's the kind of play you would normally associate with a card game doesn't exist, because you're literally building a picture on the table with cards. And to me, that's a great example of how weird card game design can be, because you can have cards that have number values. You can be interacting with pictures. I did one card game years and years ago where literally you're just basically working with a partner, almost like a bridge partner, but you were trying to create a combined picture of things in front of you. And so it's like, it was purely visual. But I've done plenty of cards that are all standard with numbers and suits. Just the number of games you can play with a standard 52 card poker deck is ridiculous. So once you actually get the ability to design your own cards, you kind of basically got the entire universe to choose from. It's really, for me, it's always about what's the approach, what's the idea. I never, like, other game designers are mechanic focused. Like they have a cool idea for how this would work. Like a dice mechanic could work this way, or a card mechanic. But I'm more like, what am I going for? Like, what's the tone, the genre, what's the experience I'm looking for? And then figuring out, like, reverse engineering that into game mechanics. And usually just stealing stuff that works, because once again, there are other people, there are actual geniuses in my industry who actually create new and innovative things. And I'm in awe of those people. I stick to what I'm good at, which is mostly on the writing and development side.
Right. And so talk to us a bit about some of that, because now also you have a couple of websites that we can talk about. One is Backstab with a Ballista. So what can your readers and your friends and your fans expect from that website?
Backstab with a Ballista is was the thing I decided to sort of replace all of where I used to post game content intended to be supported by my old Patreon account. So it was like, I decided I wanted to do an RPG focused newsletter, and I even started it with the idea that I was going to look at the new playtest for what they call 1D&D, which is sort of like the 6th edition coming out next year. So they've been putting out, Wizards of the Coast has been putting out these playtest packets to give us a preview and let the gaming community have feedback on what's going on with D&D. So I've been literally evaluating the playtest packets where I say, how do character origins change things from 5e? So I literally took 3 character sheets from 5th edition, and then I applied all of the new rules changes to see how they would shake out. And then as we go along, I literally have red marked them, so people can literally one-to-one see how the rules are changing characters on the sheet. So it's a way. So this is me kind of like putting on my game designer hat and evaluating what the changes are in the new version of D&D, and kind of giving everybody a peek under the hood. Like, this is what this actually means and why I think it works this way.
And what is your hope for 1D&D?
Well, funny enough, I because I've been doing some other things, I'm a little bit behind on the stuff I wanted to post on this site. But the funny thing is, I think the best way to explain what 1D&D looks like to me so far is that it's 5th edition taking the best lessons from 4th edition and applying them but without telling anybody because there's so much hate for 4th edition out there. But the truth is, the design philosophy for what they're doing with 1D&D or 6th edition or whatever you want to call it, is very much all about tightening up the mechanics and letting more of the story stuff breathe on its own without being directly tied into the rules.
Okay.
Because 5th edition tried to do several things, some of which were very familiar because I did them in my old games, to try to kind of have the lore and story side interact with the character sheet. So, like, easy example is how inspiration is supposed to work in 5th edition. So you have when you create your character, you pick your background, and that lets you you get some personality stuff. So you get like a personality trait, you get a background note, you get some person or thing that you have a deep connection with, and you might have a character flaw. And the idea is that if you play one of those elements in your character, the DM is supposed to give you a little reward by granting you inspiration.
Okay. It's almost like fate points. It almost kind of has this fate.
It's also exactly how plot points work in Cortex. That came out, over 15 years ago.
Right.
But I mean, that's why and in Cortex, it worked a little bit better just because the way the story and the game mechanics flowed back and forth, it was a lot more tight. And the thing with D&D, it's sort of like a lot of freeform role playing with a few skill rolls, and then suddenly you're in an action scene or combat, and suddenly the game is super crunchy. And that's kind of like the rhythm. And that they were trying to do is, they were trying to kind of bribe the players to do role playing, and they also, the background would give you some very non-crunchy reward. Like if you were, like I think it was the Acolyte. If you took the Acolyte background, like, oh, you're a member of a temple, you're welcome in this religion wherever you go, and stuff like that, which is a cool story reward. But I think what they found, though, is the problem with that kind of thing is that anytime you leave more up to interpretation for the DM, you're putting a lot more pressure on the DM to remember things, to keep up with stuff. So it's like, if I'm already a DM keeping track of monsters and campaign stuff and whose turn it is, I'm suddenly supposed to remember that this other character is obsessed with finding their missing sister, and I'm to give them an inspiration. So they've removed all of that so far from 1D&D, where it's everything is much more tight and crunchy, where it's always like, we're not gonna worry about the game giving you a benefit. Like any DM did that anyway. Like in the old days, if the player did something cool or role played really well, you'd say, take 100 experience points. You just did something cool. And then 5th edition was trying to replace that with inspiration, but it gave the DM an extra checklist of things to keep track of, and nobody can keep up with all that. So the new version is sticking to very predictable, clean game mechanics, and then just giving you lots of tools to build the world and the story and all the role playing without tying it so hard into the game mechanics itself.
Right.
And then at the same time, like all kinds of stuff that was fuzzier and open for interpretation, everything seems to be just a little bit, like I said, it's a lot more 4th edition. Like it's a very well defined. Because the truth is, a very well defined tight game is easier on people like dungeon masters just getting on board. Right. Like improvising and winging it is something you do when you're experienced and you're comfortable with the game. But so I think that's kind of what they're doing, is like, we're going to make sure that the core game is there for the players and the DM, so that it'll be more balanced. You'll know what to do, and then you can layer on all that story and character stuff as much or as little as you want.
Right.
And I think that's kind of what they're going for.
Right. And also, it's like, with that said, do you think this is kind of an evolution on how also people are able to create tabletop role-playing communities and play together online, and you don't have to actually be in the same room together?
Absolutely. And I will say, and this is another thing, just based on what I know for their business reasons, is, Wizards of the Coast purchased D&D Beyond. So now they own their digital tool set, and they've already said that they're building their own virtual tabletop to play the new version of D&D on, that will be separate from like Roll20 and Fantasy Grounds and the existing products like that. They're going to have their own official one that'll integrate with D&D Beyond. And very clearly, like whenever you've got a system like that, anything that's closer to a computer game, you're going to need to have tighter, more easily defined stuff. So like if there's a spell effect, it needs to be very clear where the area of effect is on like the virtual battle mat. You know, all these things that may have been a little looser and fuzzier, like if you're in that kind of environment, it kind of forces you to think, okay, I got to define everything very strictly so that it'll work with these digital tools that we're creating.
Right. Now, so also you also have this, like, so those that are interested, those that are listening or watching this, definitely check out Jamie's website when it comes to that. And people can go to backstabwithaballista.com. Is that?
Well, it's if you just go to backstab.fun,
that's what
will take you straight there. I found a very fun little URL that I grabbed onto. So backstab.fun will take you to that stuff. And for the moment, it's going to mostly focus on, like I said, D&D 5th edition and the new playtest. But over time, I'm probably going to add in non-D&D game stuff. Like there's a few things in here. You see, I did one. I have a video that I did a while back called about folklore and fantasy.
Okay.
And that's one where I talk about, like, I did a video essay, and I also give a new monster. And I also talk like the relationship between like traditional folklore and the monsters in D&D. Like, what's the difference between a goblin from like Germanic, middle-aged folklore versus the goblin you find in the monster manual? And like, how did we get from folklore to this little critter that we see now? So I did a whole essay on that. I may do more of that kind of thing in the future.
Also, you have another website that we talked about before we went live. And we mentioned it at the top of the show, your podcast.
Yes.
Chainsaw History. How did this start? You did, and I remember hearing that you did have once upon a time you were going to major in history. So that was,
I actually was
always
a
been
history
a history
major.
buff.
Yeah, I was a history major for most of college.
Right.
That was in the original career path that I planned for myself was to be a college history professor. So I was going to just stay in school forever, literally never leave, and just start teaching history. And then just like life changed. I ended up starting a family in the middle of college, and then just shifting some things around. I ended up becoming a double major in the very kind of last year. I shifted over to being an English lit major and minored in history instead. But yeah, that was the original plan. So like the idea of me giving long, boring history lectures is something I do when people don't even ask for it. But I love history, and to me, the biggest problem, anybody who says they don't like history, it's because they've never been exposed to it in the correct way. Because there's like anybody who loves Game of Thrones, for example, George R. R. Martin mostly just stole stuff from history, especially the War of the Roses and all these cool little things, and just threw them in there because history is all just about people in difficult situations, making crazy decisions, having to go through insane times. And it's like once you actually like explain it in human terms, it's suddenly way more interesting. It's not facts and figures and dates. That's a completely wrong way to look at things. Right. So like I'm very excited about history, and so it's always been my thing to try to pass that on. Like if I have a cool story to tell, and I also, like anybody who listens to Chainsaw History can obviously tell, I love the weird details that they don't normally tell you. Like and also too, as part of my own philosophy, I think it's a mistake to put historical figures of any stripe up on marble statues, put them on a pedestal, act like they're more than human, which is exactly why the first episode was about George Washington the way I did. So like in that case, I'll tell everybody, so our very first two-parter was about young George Washington during the time of the French and Indian War, otherwise known as the 7 Years' War everywhere else in the world. Right. And there is, and George Washington, literally the father of our nation, like the most celebrated godlike American figure. So I wanted to make it very clear to the audience where I'm coming from did 2 solid hours of talking about what he was really like. And there's plenty to admire. So it's not like it's trash talking at all, but it's, right, I am humanizing him. So without, spoiling the whole thing or taking too much time. Like, for example, like, you know, most people don't realize that like George Washington was like a very ambitious young social climber. He was like the oldest son of a second batch of kids on a second marriage. All of the older kids got the paid education and all this like benefits of their father's money and name. And he had to prove himself. He had to work for a living. He never got to go to college, which is why that's one of the reasons why Washington used Alexander Hamilton to write all of his stuff later on, all of his correspondence, because he was literally embarrassed by how he wrote. He was he was only half literate. If you read George Washington's letters, you know, he's not the most articulate guy because he never benefited from that formal education. And that's fine. He started working as a land surveyor when he was like 17 years old. And then went on. He wanted to be in the army, but he didn't want to be. But this was the time of the colonies. He desperately wanted more than anything else to be an officer in the British Army. And there's a great piece of artwork of George Washington wearing a British red coat. And that's who he fought for originally. I mean, the French and Indian War was all about that. So if you listen to that episode, you'll hear all about how George Washington kind of wormed his way into an important diplomatic mission and possibly assassinated a diplomat and possibly set off the first World War in the history of the world.
Right.
So, and then on top of that, you can hear about how he was an amazing hero rescuing a bunch of people from a dangerous, horrible battle where they got ambushed after he had diarrhea for a solid month and it was riding around on massive hemorrhoids.
Now, so how do you do research on this show? How do you do this? How do you produce it?
Okay, so I guess real quick, I'll tell you how the idea started, because that kind of feeds into it. So I do the podcast with my sister. Her name's Bambi, and with this thing, it really started during the pandemic when a lot of us had a lot more time on our hands, and so. You know how our family decided to create a little quarantine bubble where it's like we're quarantined, but my sister's family and I, we mingled with each other and avoided the rest of the world. So we hung out a lot more than we did. You know, we were all working from home. People had time off. So a lot of us were just sitting around having drinks, talking. I started telling my usual long-winded stories about stuff, and my sister was firing back with jokes and stuff. And after a few times of that kind of thing happening, I started realizing that there would be like 7 people in the room, but my sister and I were the only ones talking. Everybody else was kind of listening and laughing and seemed to be enjoying just the performance we were giving. And that was when it first occurred to me. I was like, well, maybe we should put microphones in front of us and see if we could turn this into like a thing.
Right.
So the way it works is I read several books and read articles and do some digging. Like I started with George Washington. It was an offshoot of genealogical research. I found out my family had a connection to the French and Indian War, and then I fell down a rabbit hole about Washington. So anyway, like I read several books, and then I write about a 5,000 word script. And so if you listen to Chainsaw History, it's me coming with a prepared script, even though it's written in a slightly more casual. It's not like super formal. And the idea is I read it out, and my sister comes in cold and just reacts to it. So and then she breaks in, and we turn it into a conversation. So it's not just me reading out loud,
right?
And we make our way through the topic. So yeah, we did a 2-parter on George Washington. We did a 3-part deep dive on George Wallace, former governor of Alabama, and once presidential hopeful, because I found out that a very close relative of mine campaigned for Wallace back in 1972. And that was like really disturbing, like one of the most famously racist presidential candidates in U.S. history, or at least modern. And my family was all about him.
Right. And then you had Francis Perkins.
Yes. Yeah, we did Wallace. And then Francis Perkins was almost a palate cleanser, because a lot of our episodes are about kind of questionable people. So it's like I wanted to go with somebody who's like someone I truly admired and feel like is an unsung hero of American history. Like a lot of for people who give FDR a lot of credit for the New Deal, they have no clue that Francis Perkins was the architect of most of that stuff. Yeah, we did an episode of Big Jim Folsom, Alabama. He was kind of George Wallace's mentor, but he, unlike George Wallace, who was racist bastard. Jim Folsom was a truly he was a drunk. He was maybe a little too handsy with the ladies, but he had like a good heart. He really wanted to help people. So we had at least a couple decent people to talk about in there, along with all the the monsters and
right, because you also had Nellie Bly as another one of your shows.
Yep. Yeah, we did. You'll see a couple of them that say "The Value of" is the title. The Value of Christopher Columbus, The Value of Nellie Bly. That's when we realized that me doing a bunch of research, writing a long script, and doing all this it's hard to crank out regular podcasts that way.
Right.
So we wanted to find alternate stuff we could do that wouldn't require scripted content. And my sister and I were both raised with these children's books that our parents made us go through called the Value Tales. And they were very much like these kids' history books, but they were nothing but propaganda. Like the first one we did was Christopher Columbus, because that is maybe the biggest joke of them all.
Right.
It literally, like, the book literally shows a bunch of natives like sailing back with Columbus, all happy to go to Europe, and talking about how everybody was friends. It's like completely ignoring that he was a genocidal monster, even by his own, like, the standards of the day. He was a really bad guy. So that was one where we just jump in and we kind of read parts of the book to each other and have fun with it. So we've got stacks and stacks of these Value Tales to go through as we alternate between that and the traditional scripted episodes.
I'm wondering now too, as we've been talking, and we mentioned your podcast, we mentioned your books, we mentioned your game designing. So what's next for you now, Jamie?
Well, that's a good question. I actually just kind of shifted the day job focus because life has been interesting. And right now I'm working with an online game retailer who does a lot of collectible stuff, especially a lot of like old D&D and TSR. So I've been spending a lot of time going through my favorite stuff from back in the day when I was like a teenager, cataloging and inventorying all this stuff. Both there's like one side that's for a collection and another side of it that's for resale. And it's a very different thing for me to just jump in on this side of things, but at the same time it's like getting paid to go back and play with your old toys again. Like I'm getting to like open up all these old box sets that I used to own, or looking at these old books and remembering where I was. So it's like not complaining at all. And ultimately, like, for the moment, the main thing I'm going to do is focus on those 3 community supported things I was telling you about. So I'm going to continue writing for Backstab with the Ballista. I'm going to keep doing mostly D&D content for now. My sister is bugging me for the next Chainsaw History script for us so we can record again. I'll give you a sneak peek at the one I'm working on. So anyone who paid attention to the recent Supreme Court ruling on Roe versus Wade, and not to get all political there, but regardless of how you feel, that was a big decision. Yeah. And the majority opinion, but from the court, cited this old British jurist named Matthew Hale, this guy who lived in the 16th century. And this was he was cited in this majority opinion. He's a very famous British jurist. Like, he is a guy who established a lot of law that did trickle down into America. So this doesn't come from nowhere. But at the same time, specifically for a case involving women's issues, Matthew Hale was a guy who tried witches and had them executed. He was a guy who didn't believe it was he wrote in a book and in his own legal opinions that a husband could not rape his wife because by the biblical definition a woman comes from a man's flesh and you cannot rape yourself. So the idea of a man raping his own spouse is just nonsensical in this jurist's point of view. So like, I could not, like, the moment I that name jumped out at me, I immediately once again did my like deep dive where I started reading him. I was like, wow, that like the Supreme Court cited this guy who tried actual witches as one of the reasons why women should have less rights now. So like, I think we should talk about that. So the next episode is going to be all about Sir Matthew Hale, celebrated jurist of 16th century Britain.
your podcast, so people can still listen to your podcast. That's
Absolutely.
available. People can still go to backstab.fun.
That's
They
the
can
word
go to
to
there.
And then
Okay.
chainsawhistory.com takes you to the website. And if you just want to subscribe, if you just go to listen.chainsawhistory.com, it'll take you immediately to the little thing that'll just click, and you can subscribe on any podcast platform you want. We're literally everywhere. We're on Spotify, awesome. Amazon, Apple Music, just Stitcher, Google. I mean, we're on like 27 podcast platforms. Just nice. So if you just look for Chainsaw History, you'll find us.
Yeah, all one word, Chainsaw History.
Well, the title is two separate words, but in the website it's one.
Right. Perfect. Well, thanks a lot, Jamie. You know, I've been looking forward to chatting with you for months now, so I'm really glad we're able to
Thank you for having me on.
You're welcome. Did you, because you remember, I think about that backstab with the ballista. One of my favorite, I remember when I was in college, my buddy who had all the D&D stuff had these books of, I don't know, like a book of treasures. They're like, it almost feel like they're leather bound, not size, smaller ones. And it was all these different treasures. And I remember this one, I don't know if you know this one, is catapult seeds.
Oh, yeah. And I know which books you're talking about. Those were the Encyclopedia Magica set, which was all the magic items in AD&D second edition.
Yeah,
I owned those books back in the day.
I love, and I still to this day love that idea of the catapult seed. So basically, you would throw, it's like a seed that but did the same damage as a catapult, right?
Yeah, there's all kinds of crazy items like that.